Hello and welcome to Gefet Gemara. I'm Yael Shimoni, bringing to you together with Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha, learning Iyun and your Q Daf Yomi. And today we're in a very interesting topic, not related to Avodah Zarah in any way, but it comes about. That's Darka Shel Torah. You learn Torah, you start one place and you finish in a different place. And here I want to learn with you about the Tosfot that talks about what happened with Moshe Rabbeinu. Was he a high priest at a certain time? Wasn't he? And a very interesting machloket between the Rishonim and a serious Rashi and Tosfot here. So we're going to go into Avodah Mikdash, which is a good thing to learn now at this time of the 3 weeks and soon the 9 days coming upon us. So, Be'ezrat Hashem, that's what we'll do today. First, we'll start by seeing how this Bichlal came about inside the Sugya of Avodah Zarah, and then we'll dive in. So, what's the connection? How did all this story come about here? So, in the Aflam and Gil Amud Bes and Amidad Amud Aleph, there's a machloket between the late Amoraim, Rav Zvid, and Marima, whether or not certain kind of utensils can be used if they were used by Uvdei Kochavim for wine. So Rav Zvid says, "Hai mane de kunya chiva ve'uchma shara yaroka asur mishum de mitzrah." So Rashi helps us to understand that we're talking about clay that has been burned and also covered in some kind of glass. That's what it sounds like. Maybe it's like corral. You might think not as good because here we're still having something that does catch stuff inside it. Still bolea, and we know that clay cheres they're considered kelim that you cannot use them for anything else because they're actually absorbing everything that's being used. But here there's a specific kind of clay that is also covered by something that will not make it swallow as much. And the question is, can it be used by Jews after it was used by non-Jews because we're afraid it was absorbing isurim. So the Gemara asks about Malimah, that he thinks that you can use these different colored, glass-covered clay, and he says that very clearly. Darash Malimah Kunya, which is these clay that is covered by glass. Kunya ben Uchma ben Chiva ben Yaroka Share. It doesn't matter what color it is, you can still use it. And then the Gemara asks, how could that be? When it comes to talk about Chametz and Pesach, Malimal said that you cannot use these, that they're considered like totally clay. And the Gemara concludes by saying there's a difference between using wine and using Chametz, because Chametz use it in heat, and heat will cause absorption. However, since wine is used while it's cold, the absorption is not as great. And then the Gemara remains with the question, now that there's a machloket here between Rav Zvid and Marima. And Rav Zvid said that it depends on what kind of color is being used because the colors also change the absorption, and maybe there are other views. So the Gemara is still not conclusive about can we use these at all. And then we have a story. The story begins about Rabbi Akiva. You might notice that here Tosfot says that in the Makbilah, in Gemara that's parallel to this Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit Daf Yud Aleph, Rashi says that it's not Rabbi Akiva, that it's Mar Ukva, but we won't go into that. Here it says it's Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, Rabbi Akiva ikla leGinzak. He gets to this town called Ginzak, and he's asked 3 questions that he doesn't know the answer to any. A question about Ta'anit, a question about these utensils of the Kohavim, and also an interesting question, Moshe kol shivat yemei miluim. That question will be what we're going to learn about. But let's see what happens with the 2 other questions. So he's asked these 3 questions. He doesn't know anything, a little surprising for Rabbi Akiva. Maybe it's Rabbi Akiva when he was still a beginner, but at any rate, he doesn't know. So he goes to the Bet Midrash and he gets answers for all of them. The answer that's relevant to Avodah Zarah is Hilcheta Kankanim Shel Uvdei Kochavim Lachar Yud Chodesh Mutarim. This whole discussion, can we use these utensils? The answer is yes, but after a year. After a year, they're not, anything that has been absorbed is already dried up and you can use them. That's what the halacha with Kankanim. And then in Ta'anit, Yud Aleph, this story is also brought up on because we want to know, can you do Ta'anit L'Shon? Which is not our endeavor. And then the only halacha here that doesn't have its own masechta, not Avodah Zarah, not Tannaim, is the halacha b'meh shimesh Moshe shivat yemei miluim. So that's what we're going to look into. B'meh shimesh Moshe kol shivat yemei miluim. And before we start, I want to remind you a pasuk that we say every Shabbos in Kabbalat Shabbat, Moshe ve'Aharon b'choanav u'Shmuel b'kor'ei shemo. Here in this pasuk, in Tehillim, it refers to Moshe Rabbeinu as a Kohen. Where does this come from? So when we're going to learn this sugya, we'll understand more what's the background to this pasuk. So I'm returning to the story, and I took away all the other questions. Let's just focus on our question. B'meh shimesh Moshe kol shivat yemei miluim. So first, let's do a short reminder. What are shivat yemei miluim? So when you read Sefer Shemot, you read about the building of the Mishkan, and then at the end of Sefer Shemot, the Mishkan is being raised, and then God dwells into the Mishkan. But when you read Sefer Vayikra, you hear the story was a little more complex when it came to having God entering the Mishkan. There was a whole process, 7 days, that Moshe built the Mishkan every day and dismantled it every day. And he also was doing all kinds of korbanot during these 7 days. And the Aharon and his sons had to stay in the Mishkan for these 7 days. And only in the 8th day were they given kehuna, and then they started to be over themselves. And then, and only then, after Aharon the specific korban, then God came down, and then the very hard story of Nadav and Avihu that are killed. That's the story of Shivat Yemei Miluim. So Shivat Yemei Miluim are the 7 days prior to the 8th day in Parashat Shmini, where actually God dwells in the temple after Aaron Kohen becomes the Kohen God. So here in Ginzak, they asked Rabbi Akiva, "B'meh shimesh Moshe kol shivat yemei miluim?" Since Moshe here is not exactly a Kohen, but he was acting as a Kohen, what did he wear? And behind this question, we can understand that there's a deeper question. And asking what a person wears, it's really asking who he was. Why is that? Because the Kohanim's clothes are very, very, very important. A Kohen cannot do Avodah HaMikdash if he doesn't wear the clothes of the Kohanim. There are 4 garments for Kohen Idiot and 8 garments for Kohen Gadol. And behind this question, we see a different question. Who was Moshe? Was he a Kohen Gadol? Was he a Kohen Idiot? Maybe he wasn't a Kohen at all. So let's see what the answer is. B'meh shimesh Moshe shivat yemei miluim, says the Bet Midrash Rabbi Akiva, b'chaluk lavan. Now when we hear chaluk lavan, it's unclear. Is this a way to describe him as somebody not wearing the 8th clothes of Kohen Gadol, and it's describing him as a Kohen Idiot? But Kohen Idiotot don't have chalukim. The word chaluk doesn't work with any of any bigdei kehuna. So this is a mystery. Rav Kahana adds to the mystery, and he says, Rav Kahana matnei bechaluk lavan she'en lo imra. It wasn't just a white cloak. It didn't have an imra. It means it didn't have this the ending that you fold in and sew. You can see this in my garment. There was no ending of that sort. And the question is, why is this so important to understand? So this is not just any random white cloak. It was a specific white cloak. That's what it sounds like by Rav Kahana. So let's begin by looking at Rashi here. And Rashi says very interesting things, which are far from being trivial, and what's written here. So Rashi says, Moshe לא משתמש בבגדי הכהונה, דכתיב עשית בגדי קודש לאהרון אחיך, והוא היה זר אצלם. הוא היה זר אצלם, ועל פי הדיבור שימש ולא הזכרו בגדים. Okay, so the most important word here in Rashi is the word zal. Rashi says, even though Moshe was wearing these clothes, these were not bigdei kehuna. How do I know? Says Rashi, because there's a pasuk, ve'asita bigdei kodesh le'aharon achicha. The bigdei kodesh of Aharon Kohen were specifically for Aharon, and therefore anyone else, including Moshe, who would wear these clothes, he would be a Zar. A Zar means somebody who's not a Kohen. So Rashi says he was not a Kohen. So how come he was working there? Al pi adibur shimesh. It was a specific halacha that God told him. God did not make him into a Kohen. He just said, even though you're not a Kohen, you will be the one to work in Shivat Yemei HaMilui. So Rashi is very clear on this point. Moshe was not a Kohen. Continues Rashi and to the next Dibur Matchil about the Imra, the ending of the cloth. And of course, Rashi has to explain why, if Moshe was not a Kohen, why is there such detail about the ending of the cloth? I'll explain more. Bigdei kehuna don't have an ending because they're built, they're not sewed, they're woven, and therefore there's no sewing in anywhere. So if we read the Gemara, we might think that saying that this cloak did not have an ending, a sewed ending, it's as if a way to describe it as a bigdei kehuna. But Rashi here is against that. And let's see what Rashi says. Imra safa. יש אומר שלא יחשדו ששם בה מתרומת המשכן, ולאו מילתא שהרי נגמרה המלאכה ובשעת עבודה מהיכן שקי. So Rashi here brings us a perush that he goes against. He says, I know somebody who said that the reason there was no sewed ending was so people would not suspect Moshe for hiding something in this sewed end. And that's why he had to have this unsewed ending. So of course, this Yesh Misha Omer thinks like Rashi that this ending has nothing to do with bigdei kehuna and it has a lot to do with suspicion. But Rashi says, I don't think this is true, even though we know people suspected Moshe. It was while he was building the Mishkan and not now when he was already working in the Mishkan and the Mishkan was already built. So Rashi seems to go against this perush, but not because he says, you don't understand, this is a way of bigdei kehuna. No, Rashi agrees with the idea that the non-ending has nothing to do with bigdei kehuna. It just doesn't think it has to do with somebody suspecting Moshe. So why is this written here? Rashi does not give us an alternative answer, and that is really a bit of a problem with what Rashi says here. So Rashi in Masechet Yoma, Daf Gimel Amud Bet, also repeats this idea that the fact that the Gemara says that he was wearing this white cloak is the way of the Gemara to tell us that he was a Zar. He was not really a Kohen, and there he also has a very interesting statement that even though you call what Moshe did an Avodah, it wasn't really an Avodah, because if you compare Avodah of Moshe and Miluim to Avodah of Kohanim, it is not considered Avodah. ואם בשביל ששימש משה כל שבעת ימי המילואים אין קרוא היה עבודה אצל עבודת הכהנים שהוא בלבוש בגדי כהונה ושל משה בחלוק לבן. He says what you wear is the way that we view what you do, and since Moshe was wearing this white cloak as is written here in our Gemara, that's why we know that his work was not really considered avodat kohanim. So according to Moshe, to Rashi, Moshe was not a Kohen. Even at the time that he worked in the Mishkan, he was not a Kohen. So Tosfot doesn't go against Rashi. Well, trying to make this point clear, he's not cholek on Rashi. He's only telling us that in a different Gemara, we see that what Rashi said is something very clear is actually in a dispute between the Tannaim and the Amoraim. Which Gemara is this? It's the Gemara in Zvachim, Kuf Aleph Amud Bet, and also Kuf Bet Amud Aleph, which will open presently. So let's see first what Tosfot says, what's his kushia. So the Tosfot begins by saying, Peresha Kontras, okay, he's quoting Rashi, ומשה לא נשתמש בבגדי כהונה, דכתיב לאהרון אחיך, והוא היה זר אצלם. Okay? That's the sheet of Rashi, that Moshe was not a Kohen at any point. וקשה למאן דאמר בפרק טבול יום מזבחים, משה רבנו עליו השלום כהן גדול היה, ונשתמש בכהונה גדולה מן שנה. Says it also that if you'll go to Zvachim, you'll see that there's someone, and we'll see that someone shortly, that thinks that not only was Moshe Rabbeinu a Kohen Gadol, he was a Kohen Gadol for the entire 40 years in the desert. השתמש בכהונה גדולה מם שנה, 40 שנה. So this is a huge machloket in what Rashi described. Somebody who says that Moshe Rabbeinu was never a Kohen, to a different view in the Gemara, that Moshe was actually Kohen Gadol for the entire 40 years alongside with Aharon. And the Tosfot says, I want to understand this Tana, this person who thinks this in Zavachim, how does he read our Gemara? Because our Gemara says that Moshe wore this white cloak. So how did they view this white cloak? And he also adds, let's read it again. So says Tosfot, if you think that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen Gadol for the entire 40 years, you should have asked a different question in the Gemara. Was Moshe wearing the same clothes as Aharon, or maybe he had a different set of garments for the entirety of the 40 years? ולא יוכל להשיב על זה בחלוק לבן שאין בו אמרה, דלשון כהונה גדולה משמע בחטא בגדים ככהן גדול. Says the Tosfot, it is very clear that if you think Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen Gadol for 40 years, you can never say that he wore a white cloak for 40 years. Why? Because the term Kohen Gadol always means that he wore the 8 clothes of Kohen Gadol. So according to Tosfot, Moshe, according to this Deah, wore the 8th clothes, and only on the Miluim he didn't wear the 8th clothes of Kohen Gadol. And the question is why? If Moshe was anyway a Kohen Gadol, why couldn't he just wear the regular garments during Yemei Miluim? We should have had a different Gemara here. What did Moshe wear in Yemei Miluim? If you think that he was a Kohen Gadol, he already wore the entire 8 clothes during Yemei Miluim. So that's Tosfot's question. And before we go into his answers, let's see the Gemara that he's built on. So the Gemara begins in Daf Ufalef Amud Bet. By Machloket Amoraim, I already brought you the Tannaim in the next page that say the different views. So here the Gemara is based on a question on the psukim of the Sneh. Remember, in the Sneh, Moshe meets God in the desert. He sees this fire inside the bush, and he goes closer. The bush is not destroyed, and then after whole conversation that God is trying to convince Moshe to become his shaliach, his messenger to take Israel out of Egypt. And Moshe doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to become the leader. He doesn't want to be the messenger of God. And first he gives all kinds of explanations because he can't speak well and whatever. And then he says, Ve'amar bi Adonai, shlachna be'at tishlach. I don't want to go. Just like that. And then there's a very interesting pasuk, Vayicharaf Adonai b'Moshe. God is mad. God is mad with Moshe. And then God says, Vayomer halo Aharon achicha halevi, yadati kedaber edaber hu, והנה גם הוא יוצא לקראתך ורעך ושמח בליבו. God tells Moshe, okay, you won't be alone. Aharon will come with you. And the Tannaim, not only the Tannaim, it's also a question in the Pshat. This is very, very strange that there is an anger from God and there's no punishment. We were expecting to have a punishment, and then there's no punishment. There's just a description of actually giving Moshe what he wanted, adding Aaron to help him and telling him that Aaron will be happy to help him. This doesn't sound like a punishment. So here in the Gemara, there is a machloket around this pasuk. Tannaim, Vayicharaf Adonai b'Moshe. רבי יהושע בן קורחה אומר, כל חרון אף שבתורה נאמר בו רושם, וזה לא נאמר בו רושם. According to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, this is indeed an exception. This is the only place in the Torah that there is an anger from God, that there was no punishment after. That's what he says. Rashbi is cholek. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai אומר, אף זה נאמר בו רושם, שנאמר, הלא אהרון אחיך הלוי, והלא כהן הוא, הכי כאמר, אני אמרתי אתה כהן והוא לוי, עכשיו הוא כהן ואתה לוי. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, he thinks that here in this pasuk there is a punishment. When God is describing Aharon, he's actually telling Moshe, Aharon was supposed to be a Levi. You were supposed to be a Kohen, Aharon was supposed to be a Levi. Now that you will not go on your own accord, he will become a Kohen and you'll become a Levi. So according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the punishment for Moshe Rabbeinu for not wanting to be the leader is that he will not be a Kohen. This is the punishment. חכמים אומרים, לא נתקיים משה אלא שבעת ימי המילואים בלבד. According to חכמים, Moshe was a Kohen only at the time of שבעת ימי המילואים. It sounds as if they agree to the idea of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but they think that it was happening, that he was a bit of a Kohen, and then it was taken from him. And then there is the cholek that says, יש אומרים, ופסקה כהונה עלה מזרעו של משה, שנאמר משה איש האלוהים, בניו יקראו על שבט לוי. ואומר משה ואהרון בכהניו, ושמואל וקורא שמו. מהי ואומר? וחיתם על הדורות הוא דכתיב, ואומר משה ואהרון בכהניו. So, according to the Yeshomrim, Moshe, here we see this dea that Tosfot was quoting. Moshe was a Kohen Gadol because it's described that way in the Torah. Moshe ish Elohim banav ikaru al shevet Levi. Moshe ish Elohim, that's a different way of saying Moshe is the Kohen Gadol. Banav ikaru al shevet Levi says that there was a punishment that his kids, his descendants were not Kohanim. Only Aaron's descendants were Kohanim, but he, Moshe, was Ish Elohim, was Kohen Gadol, and that's what we say in Kabbalat Shabbat, Moshe ve'Aaron bechoanav, meaning that Moshe ve'Aaron were together Kohanim Gedolim. But it is only at that time that Moshe was Kohen and his children were not. So this machloket is where we see the de'ah that Tosfot wants to explain. The Yeshomrim, says the Tosfot, how does he read our sugya? How does he understand what happened in the Yemei HaMiluim? So the Tosfot has two answers. The first answer, V'yesh lomar. Again, I'm repeating the question. If Moshe was a Kohen Gadol, why didn't he wear the Bigdei Kehuna Gedola also at the 7 days of the Miluim? If I think like the Yeshomrim. So Tosfot has to explain why, even though you are Kohen Gadol, you couldn't wear Bigdei Kehuna in the 7 days of the Miluim. First answer, ויש לומר, דשיבת ימי המילואים דווקא היא בעיה, שעדיין לא נתקדשו בגדי כהונה, כדכתיב ויזית על אהרון ועל בגדיו. So the first answer here in the Tosfot is that the 7 days of the Miluim, there were no Bigdei Kehuna operating yet. When did the Bigdei Kehuna become operative? Only after they were hazaya. There was blood thrown on them. And that was only at the 8th day. So therefore, it is true that you are supposed to wear Bigdei Kehuna Gdola if you're doing the Avodah of the Kohen Gadol, but only when God says the Bigdei Kehuna Gdola are relevant. And God said they were irrelevant till the 8th day. That's the first answer in the Tosfot. The second answer in the Tosfot is the answer of Rabbi Yaakov Mi'orlainish. He's a different about Tosfot. And he says, he says, no, the Bigdei Kehuna were always operative. And actually, he was supposed to wear them. So why wasn't he wearing them? מכל מקום כל זין ימי המילואים שהיה משה מעמיד המשכן ומפרקו, היה נחשב כמו במה. So a big chiddush of Rabbi Yaakov Mi'orlainish, that at the time that Moshe was building and dismantling the temple for these 7 days, the temple was not really considered a temple as far as Kedusha goes. He was considered a bama ktana. And in bama ktana, if you go to Zvachim, Daf Kuf Yutet, you will see that there is no chovad. You don't wear Bigdei Kehuna when you are working in a bama. So that's why he didn't wear, even though the clothes were there, they were operative, but they were only relevant to the Mishkan, and the Mishkan wasn't a Mishkan, and he was a bama. And finishes the Tosfot and says, you might have a kushia that you shouldn't ask. I'll tell you what the kushia is. En le'akshot, alo en chatat karev bebama. In bamot, you can't put chatat. You can only bring olah or shlamim. That's what we see when we read the Nevi'im. And here in Yemei HaMiluim, there was also a chatat yachid. So if it's a chatat yachid, it's a mishkan, it's not a bama. So it's also, that's not a good question. Why? Because this chatat yachid was very, very unique. The chatat yachid was chatat yachid nisrefet. This doesn't happen anywhere else. It was hora'at sha'ah. Don't ask that question. So we have two answers in the Tosfot. And if you will look at the Tosfot of the Rosh Mishan, this is a different way of Tosfot, you'll see that the one who answered the first question in the Tosfot was the Rosh Mishan. So we have here two answers. Let's sum them up. According to the Tosfot, why, if Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen Gadol, why didn't he wear the 8th clothes of the Kehuna Gdola at the time of the Miluim? How come the Gemara says that he was only wearing white? It is because either A, the Bigdei Kehuna were not operative yet, or B, they were operative, but the Mishkan itself wasn't a Mishkan yet. So those were two options here in the Tosfot. Now I want to show you a very interesting call in the Rashba that I got to this by, I read a very interesting article, you can look it up in the internet, about this topic for this year. And he showed me through the Rashba, this is Rav Zev Peep. You're welcome to read his what he wrote, a very good essay. So here the Rashba gives a different answer. And what we saw was that Rashi and Tosfot are not really in a machloket. Only Tosfot is trying to explain a different daya. But Rashi seemed to be pasking a daya, that he made a decision from all the deot that we saw in Zevachim, that the right daya is the daya of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that Moshe was never a Kohen Gadol. The Rashba has a different answer and a different reading, also different from the Tosfot. So where does this answer comes from? It seems that somebody was still bothered by the Shita of Rashi. How come it says that this garment didn't have an ending? שאלת עוד, הד אמרינן רב כהנא, מתני בחלוק לבן שאין בו אמרה, למה למאמר הכי? Why did Rav Kahana talk about the ending of the cloth? בוודאי אין הכוונה לומר דזרו אצל בגדי כהונה, לכתיב לאהרון ולאחיך, אבל למאמר לא נשתמש משה בבגדי כהונה כלל. The one who asked the Rashi with the question, he says, it doesn't sound that Rashi is right, because talking about an ending of the cloth is after describing Bigdei Kehuna. And Rashi said that it's talking about the fact that Moshe was not a Kohen, that he was a Zarah. So the Rashi answers and he says, you're right. I don't agree with Rashi. I don't think what's written here is that he was a Zarah. ונראה משום דמעיל של כהן גדול תכלת נעשה של משה לבן להפריש ביניהם, ושאין בו אמרה לומר שלא היה לו אמרה תפורה אלא מעשה הורג כבגדי כהונה דכתיב בו מעשה הורג. Okay, so according to the Rashba, this is a very big chiddush. According to the Rashba, what's written in the Gemara is not that Moshe did not wear bigdei kehuna, the 8th begadim, during the 7 days of Miluim. No, he did wear all of these garments, but there was a difference between what he wore and what Aharon wore. What was the big difference? When Aharon wears the begadim, he wears a me'il, which is kelil techelet. It is a certain kind of blue. And Moshe had to be distincted from Aharon, and he had a different kind of me'il. His me'il was white. So you can imagine that Moshe looks exactly like Aharon, only he's wearing white underneath, behind the Urim v'Tumim. And that's how the Rashba reads the Gemara. The Gemara here doesn't ask V'meshimesh Moshe, meaning didn't he wear the 8th clothes? No, he did wear all the garments, only a different color cloak underneath. So according to the Rived, we understand very well why Rav Kahana said that the cloak didn't have an ending, because it's the way of the Gemara to explain to us that what Moshe was wearing was a different colored beged kehuna. So if we'll sum up this machloket, we see there's a machloket between Rashi and the Rashba. According to Rashi, the Gemara here says that he was a Zar, and he doesn't explain Rav Kahana very well. According to the Rashba, he explains Rav Kahana perfectly, and he says, no, it's just a different colored beged kehuna that Moshe was wearing to make him seem different from Aaron Kohen. And Tosfot gave a different answer, again, not opposing Rashi, only saying that there's a different daya in the Gemara, and how did they read this Gemara, that he didn't wear beged kehuna because beged kehuna were irrelevant at the time, either because the Mishkan was not considered a Mishkan, or because beged kehuna were not operating yet. So this is the big machloket we have here, and I'm summing up 3 deot. Rashi, he was a Zar. Rashba, he wasn't a Zar, he was a Kohen Gadol with a different colored me'il. And Tosfot, he was a Kohen Gadol, but there was no need to wear the begadim at the time of the Shivat Yemei. And this goes really with all the deot that we saw in the Sechet Zevachim. Now I want to show you that actually we didn't find a good de'ah of explaining the Rashba. And if we'll look into the Midrashim, we will see Midrash Tanchuma, a big machloket that is actually, again, a similar machloket to what we saw in Zvachim, but with more detail. So Midrash Tanchuma Boomer in Parashat Shmini, there we have a Midrash that says very clearly what Rashi thought, or with a variation that may be working with the Tosfot in a better way. אמרו רבותינו, כל אותם ימים שהיה משה בסנה, אמר לו הקדוש ברוך הוא לך בשליחותי, והוא אומר שלח נא ביד תשלח. כך היום הראשון והשני. אמר לו הקדוש ברוך הוא, אני מפתה אותך ואתה אומר שלח, חייך אני פורע עליך. למחר כשיעשה את המשכן תהיה סבור בעצמך שתשמש בכהונה גדולה, ואני אומר לך קרא לאהרון שישמש, וכך נאמר קרא משה לאהרון ולבניו. So according to this midrash, really Moshe thought that he would become the Kohen Gadol, but then God surprised him by saying, you thought that you would be, but you won't be. And why is that? Because because he did not want to become the leader. So this is mamash the shita of Rashi. But in Midrash Tanchuma, Buber, and Chukat, you have a lot of different views that are much more like the Rashi and the Tosfot. Moshe and Aharon bechoanav. Okay, that's the beginning of Parashat Chukat, the pasuk that we quoted. Rabbi Yehuda בשם רבי יוסי ורבי יהודה, רבי ברכיה בשם רבי יהושע בן קורחה. כל אותם 40 שנה של ישראל במדבר לא נמנע משה מלשמש בכהונה הגדולה. הדר עוד הכתיב משה ואהרון בכהניו. ורבי ברכיה בשם רבי שמעון אמרתי למאחה, משה ובני עמרם אהרון ומשה והבדל אהרון לקדשו קודש קודשים, הוא בניו אדוני להקטיר ולברך בשמו. משה איש האלוהים בניו יקראו על שבט לוי. So these are two deot that both of them say that Moshe was Kohen Gadol for the entirety of the time in the desert. Much more Tannaim here than we saw in the Gemara and Zvachim that are siding with the idea that Tosfot was really working on. And here, listen closely, we'll find somebody who says what the Rashba said. Amar Rabbi Elazar berabbi Yossi, shat hulan shebechaluk lavan shimesh Moshe bamidbar. So here we see Rabbi Elazar berabbi Yossi that says, I think that even though he was in the midbar for 40 years, but he was wearing a white cloak, and the Rashba is a way of understanding this statement here in the Midrash. אמר רבי תנחום בר יהודה, כל 7 ימים היה משמש משה בכהונה גדולה, ולא שרתה שכינה על ידו, וכיוון שבא אהרון לשמש בכהונה גדולה, שרתה שכינה על ידו. הדר הוא דכתיב כי יום הזה נראה אליכם. Also Rabbi Tanchum sounds more like the Rashba, because he says that even in the 7 days, Moshe Rabbeinu was wearing the begadim of kehuna gedola. But again, it says that he had the white cloak. So if we'll sum up here, we find here in the Midrash Tannaim that can help the Rashba to be based upon Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, and also the last day in the Midrash. So what we've done up till now is to show you these 3 different descriptions of Moshe, and the big machlok whether or not Moshe was punished because he punished by having the kehuna gadol taken away from him because of shlach na be'at tishlach, and Rashi here said that that was his punishment. Now, an interesting thing in Rashi is, and this is not in the Tosfot, this I'm just wanting to add in the shiur, because we're approaching the 9 days, that Rashi on the Torah has a secret on this pasuk. Let's see what Rashi says on the pasuk, shlach na be'at tishlach. Here Rashi doesn't say the story of the kehuna gedola, he says something else. דבר אחר, ביד אחר שתצטרך לשלוח, שאין סופי להכניסם לארץ להיות גואלם לעתיד. יש לך שלוחים הרבה. According to Rashi, when Moshe says, ויאמר בי אדוני, שלח נא ביד תשלח, what he says is, I know that I will not enter Eretz Yisrael, so therefore, if you don't want me to bring them in, take the one you want as the leader to bring them in and have him do the entire job. And a very big question on Rashi is, how come Rashi says here, already in the Sneh, that Moshe knew he wouldn't enter Eretz Yisrael? Rashi himself, in Parashat Avodah, when Moshe tells Yitro, אנחנו נכנסים לארץ ישראל, so Rashi says that there Moshe thought that he would enter Eretz Yisrael because there was no Zarah yet in Chena Meraglim. So how can Rashi say, on one hand, that on the Sneh, Rashi explains that Moshe thought that he didn't enter Eretz Yisrael, and suddenly something changed in Parashat Avodah? There's a contradiction here in Rashi, and we have all kinds of Perushim trying to give answers. But I want to show you an interesting Parshan, the Taz, which is an Aharon, a big Masakelim on Shulchan Aruch. He also wrote on the Torah, and he says something very interesting on this Rashi. And says the Taz the follows: Ve'esh lomar, שוודאי היה רצון הקדוש ברוך הוא שלא ייכנס משה לארץ ישראל אפילו בלא גזירה מצד שחטא משה, אלא מצד שיש טובה לישראל. Says the Taz, the only way to explain that Moshe understood already in the Sneh that he would not go into Eretz Yisrael is because his non-entering Eretz Yisrael was good for Am Yisrael. It wasn't because of his sin. It was for a good reason. What's this good reason? כמו שכתוב במדרש, and we'll see a midrash soon, אילו הכניס משה את ישראל לארץ ישראל, לא היה אפשר להיות בית המקדש חרב. Says the Taz, if you read the midrash, it says that if Moshe would have entered with Am Yisrael and built Beit HaMikdash would never have been destroyed. Now this is surprising. Why is this good? Why is this bad? The fact that Beit HaMikdash will not be destroyed, this is a description of something bad? So the midrash continues and says, ואין זו טובה באמת לישראל. It's not good for Am Yisrael that the temple cannot be destroyed. Why? כי עתידים לחטוא. ועצת אש בציון, מקילה חמתו בעצים ואבנים, ונשארו ישראל קיימים. The destruction of the temple, according to the midrash, is a good thing for Am Yisrael because it allows God to destroy the temple instead of destroying Am Yisrael when they're doing a sin. So that's why we don't want the temple to be immune for destruction. We want the temple to be something that can be destructed. This is how the Taz understands that Rashi and the Torah. And how come Moshe thought that this would change? The Taz explains here that Moshe thought that maybe Am Yisrael will not sin. And that's why he thought he could go into Eretz Yisrael. But once he realized that Am Yisrael will continue to sin, he knew that the right thing would be for him not to go into Eretz Yisrael so the temple can be something that can be destroyed. And I want to finish by reading Eicha Rabbah that also says this about a Mizmor in Tehillim, the Mizmor that describes the destruction of the temple, Mizmor le'asaf, begins, Mizmor le'asaf, Elohim ba'u go'im benachalatecha. And the Midrash asks, how come this description of the destruction of the temple begins with the word Mizmor? מה מזמור? Says the Midrash. לא הווי קרא צריך למימר אלא בכי לאסף, קינה לאסף. מה זה מזמור לאסף? How can you take a description of the destruction of the temple and call it a mizmor? You should call it a kina. And then the Midrash brings a mashal. אלא משל למלך שעשה בית חופה לבנו וסעידה וקריה וצירה ויצא בנו לתרבות רעה. מיד עלה המלך לחופה וקרא את הבלהות ושיבר את הקנים ונטל פדגוג שלו עיבוב של קנים והיה מזמר. Okay, a king created a beautiful home for his son, and then his son became corrupted. So the king comes and he destroys the house. And then the teacher of the son takes a flute and starts singing and dancing. People are asking him, אמרו לו, המלך הפך חופתו של בנו ואתה יושב ומזמר? The king destroyed the house that he built for his son, and you're singing? אמר להם, מזמר אני שהפך חופתו של בנו ולא שפך חמתו על בנו. I'm happy that he did not hurt the child, and then he only heard the building for the child. כך אמרו לו לאסף, הקדוש ברוך הוא החריב היכל במקדש ואתה יושב ומזמר, how come you're singing when the temple is being destroyed? tells them אסף, אמר להם, מזמר אני ששפך הקדוש ברוך הוא חמתו על העצים והאבנים ולא שפך חמתו על ישראל. ברוך השם, the temple was destroyed but Am Yisrael survived. הדר הוא דכתיב והצת אש בציון ותאכל יסודותיה. So here we see in Rashi, at least according to the Taz, a very important idea for us to take with us into the 9 days. It is true that we are sorrowed and deeply sorrowed by the destruction of the temple. But on the other hand, we have to understand and to learn this from Moshe, that Moshe always understood that what's really important in Am Yisrael. Moshe also thought that he was less important than Am Yisrael. Moshe tells Kadosh Baruch Hu, erase me from your book so Am Yisrael will survive. And Moshe also understood that the temple is not as important in regard to Am Yisrael. The temple will be destroyed, but Am Yisrael will survive. So on one hand, we are deeply sorry by the destruction of the temple, but on the other hand, we know that because of this destruction, Am Yisrael is still here. And we have to find every way we can to help Am Yisrael find its way and continue to happiness and glory, and not only dwell upon the sorrow, but to take the sorrow as a way to help Am Yisrael grow. And this we learn from Moshe, that instead of being a Kohen, he became something else, according to Rashi, somebody who's here only for Am Yisrael and seeing that as the more important thing. So I took this opportunity to add this midrash at the end. Again, it's not here in the Gemara. I hope you enjoyed our tour, Kedarka Shel Torah, that we're learning Avodah Zarah, but we're also getting to other different new places. And of course, this topic is very, very, I think, important and relevant to the days that we're in. So Be'ezrat Hashem, continue learning, and we will meet again next week. Take care.